I welcome Hamish Johnston to give this lecture on Matthew Forster Heddle, unknown, as it says on our blurb here, an unknown pioneer of Scotland's mountains. Now, Hamish, it's traditional to say a little bit about our speakers before we begin, so I will do. Hamish retired 13 years ago as HR Director of Highland Acute Hospitals NHS Trust. But that's really, of course, not why he's here today. He's here today to talk about his great-great-grandfather, Matthew Forster Heddle. And it's fair to say your interest in Heddle coincides with an interest in climbing Munros, I would surmise. Mm-hmm. And this all began with Hamish's realisation that Heddle was uncelebrated, and thought that he was a figure, as we will undoubtedly learn, he was a figure that needed to be celebrated, and set off to put that right. Along the way, Hamish discovered that there was no biography of Heddle, and so he decided to research and write it, and that was published in 2015 by National Museums Scotland, and I believe we have some examples of aforesaid wonderful tome on the desk up ahead. And as Hamish says here, and I quote, "I think that Heddle's place in the history of Scottish mountaineering is not adequately recognised, and I'm currently trying to put things right." So this is one small step on that road. Yep. And before you start, I'll just share the PowerPoint. Is that it shared? Jamie, can you see it? Excellent. We're good. We're good to go.
Okay. Right, I'll kind of do something when I want the thing changed.
Yeah.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here in Dornoch at the UHI Centre for History. I suspect that nobody here knows anything about Professor Matthew Forster Heddle other than perhaps any geologists amongst you. This is because while his reputation as Scotland's greatest mineralogist is assured, his role as a pioneer of hill walking and mountaineering in Scotland is scarcely known at all. These two aspects of his life are inseparable, and tonight you will hear about his scientific life, but I am going to concentrate mainly on his field work and his hill-going career, including an awful lot about Sutherland, which I think is appropriate for where we are. Okay? Heddle is an extremely shadowy figure in the mountaineering literature. For example, Ken Crockett's Mountaineering in Scotland, the Early Years, contains only a passing reference and a footnote. And Ian Mitchell's Scotland's Mountains Before the Mountaineers says not a word about him. So does that matter, you may ask? Well, it matters a lot, because in 1898, Hugh Munro, now famous as the creator of the tables of the 3,000 feet mountains of Scotland, was president of the Scottish Mountaineering Club, the SMC, and he wrote this after Heddle's death, I quote, "There can be little doubt that Professor Heddle had climbed far more Scottish mountains than any man who has yet lived. No district was unknown to him, and scarcely any high mountain unclimbed by him. And wherever he went, there went not merely the trained geologist, but the truest lover and keenest observer of nature, and above all of the Scottish mountains." Munro added, and I quote again, "It's a satisfaction to some of us who were members of committee in 1893 to remember that it was decided to admit a limited number of honorary members to the club, mainly because we desired to do honour to Professor Heddle. That Heddle's not better known is not because he doesn't deserve it, but because he's largely invisible. He was neither a self-publicist, nor was he a particularly clubbable person. And significantly, when the SMC was founded in 1889, Heddle was at the very end of his active hill-going career, while the great early names of the SMC were then still young men. Okay. This and the next slide illustrate my point about the prevailing ignorance of Heddle's achievements. Heddle was still alive when, in 1895, Lionel Hinks, who later became SMC vice president, published a journal paper called Strathcarron as a Climbing Centre. Unaware of Heddle's achievements, Hinksman wrote, and I quote, "To the southeast of Strathcarron lies the as yet unexplored country about the headwaters of the Ling, and further afield still, the glorious mountain region of Loch Duich and Kintail." Now, Heddle must have choked on his dinner when he read that, because in the course of his mineralogical activities, he had explored this area and climbed most of its hills many years before. He was moved to write a paper called Southwest Ross, in which he referred to the then current OS 1-inch sheets 72 and 82 that cover the area. These two maps contain 36 separate Munros and many tops, but rather than list the 31 that he had climbed, Heddle names the 5 that he hadn't climbed. Okay? You changed?
Yeah,
okay.
It's done.
Right. It's also worth remembering that the purpose and discipline of Heddle's mineralogical science required him to do much more than simply reach the summits. Heddle did not complete Southwest Ross, but it was important enough to be published posthumously in 1898. Commenting on it, Hugh Munro said, I quote, "This article was written by one who not only had an intimate acquaintance with the country, but was also able to add much out of his own knowledge to existing maps. The district described is one of the most interesting, if one of the least known, in Scotland, and there can be little doubt that the information given will prove of the greatest use to subsequent visitors." Okay? In his paper, Heddle makes observations and recounts a variety of experiences on some of the mountain journeys he made in this area, including what he called his Great Traverse from Cluny in Glen Shiel to Glencarron, undertaken with the Reverend William Peyton over 4 days in 1882. I show their route on a modern OS map, surveyed after hydro schemes had enlarged Lochs Malardoch and Mona, the route running against the grain, across the big glens, then along the ridges. Putting Hinksman in his place, Heddle wrote with ample justification, I quote, "With scarce an exception, I have been at the top of every 3,000 feet peak of the district named, and that in almost every case with a 4-pound hammer at my side and a 14-pound one over my shoulder, and that in the district named I have found several new localities of minerals and several interesting rocks now in the Museum of Science and Art, Edinburgh. This was done a considerable number of years ago, and I therefore hardly think that the district can be said to be as yet unexplored." If Heddle is largely invisible in the mountaineering literature, the achievements that Munro recognised are revealed in various unpublished sources and in Heddle's many scientific papers. His own marked maps are another important source. However, I must stress that although Heddle was a meticulous recorder of everything he did, his logbooks and field notebooks have disappeared. There is undoubtedly very much more to his hill-going than I can recount. Okay? Having established, I hope, Heddle's hill-going credentials, I must provide some context by running quickly through the essentials of his life before we continue to explore his mountain career further. Heddle's father, Robert, made a fortune as a trader in West Africa during the Napoleonic Wars. He returned to Britain in 1818, bringing with him 4 daughters by his mixed-race mistress, who was left behind. Robert bought the Melsetter estate on Hoy, Orkney, from Major James Moody, its bankrupt owner, and married Moody's daughter Henrietta. Heddle was born at Melsetter in 1828 and was named after a business friend of his father. He was always known as Forster rather than Matthew. He was educated in Edinburgh, first at the Academy and then at Merchiston Castle. Okay. Between 1844 and 1851, Heddle studied medicine at Edinburgh University, where one of his professors was James Young Simpson, the pioneer of anaesthesia in obstetrics. The medical syllabus included botany and natural history, which were much to Heddle's liking. One summer he went to Germany to study mineralogy, and his MD thesis was not on a clinical subject, but on the ores of the metals. Heddle's precocious talent was such that he was elected president of the Edinburgh Geological Society in 1851, aged just 22, and only a few months after he qualified as a doctor. He now practiced in the deprived Grassmarket area, but he soon realised that he was not suited to dealing with patients, and he tried to change careers, although without immediate success. Meantime, in parallel with medical practice, Heddle engaged in pioneering field work in Scotland and was elected a councillor of the Royal Physical Society of Edinburgh. He published scientific papers in their Transactions and also in Sir David Brewster's prestigious philosophical magazine. Heddle escaped from medicine in 1856 when he became assistant and then from 1862 the full professor of chemistry at St Andrews University. He held this post until he retired in 1884. He loved teaching, but he disliked the university, which he later described as, I quote, a sinking ship and a dead hole. This was because the number of students was steadily declining at the time, and as the only science in the syllabus, his subject was constantly undermined by his traditional colleagues, who thought it was responsible for deterring applications. Heddle referred to his colleagues as, I quote, classical duffers, and he urged the university to meet the needs of nearby industrial Dundee. Okay? Now, what kept Heddle sane was his parallel life in geology and mineralogy. He longed for the 6 summer months when the university was in recess and he could escape to the mountains, glens and islands. All the while, he was building up a huge mineral collection and recording massive amounts of information about Scotland's geology and mineralogy. By the mid-1870s, he was ready to start publishing. 70 or more of his scientific papers appeared over the next 20 years. In 1876, Heddle became a founder member and vice president of the Mineralogical Society of Great Britain and Ireland, and then a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. In 1879, he was the recipient of the RSE's prestigious Keith Prize, joining such great winners as James Clerk Maxwell. Okay. Heddle retired in 1884 and had a short-lived, controversial but lucrative spell in the goldfields of South Africa before returning home to continue his life's work. In 1895, his great Scottish mineral collection was acquired by the Museum of Science and Art in Edinburgh, now the National Museum of Scotland, in Chambers Street. The collection was described by the Scotsman as, I quote, not only the most representative gathering of Scottish minerals, but also, it's safe to say, the finest national collection of the minerals of any one country in the world. His magnum opus was the posthumous 2-volume The Mineralogy of Scotland, published in 1901, and still regarded as the classic work on its subject. Heddle married in 1858 and had 10 children who survived into adulthood, including my great-grandmother. He died in St Andrews in 1897. To grasp how and why Heddle acquired his comprehensive knowledge of Scotland's mountains and geology, we must understand his life's ambition. In the 1878 preface to what was to be a series of major papers on the mineralogy of the Northern Isles and counties, Heddle wrote that his aim was to verify or dispute all reports published by previous mineralogists. He had worked on this over the previous 25 years and had succeeded in visiting all but half a dozen of the known mineral localities north of the Forth and Clyde. But Heddle's ambition of creating a comprehensive encyclopedia of Scottish minerals meant that he also explored those parts of Scotland where the others had not been. That he achieved his goal is proved by the fact that of all British minerals known in 1901, Heddle himself was responsible for the discovery of 1/3 of all the mineral species from Scotland and for 1/4 of all the British species. The scale of this achievement is hard to grasp, but it does help to explain the completeness of Heddle's knowledge of Scotland's mountains and geology. Okay. Now, today we take for granted our rights of access, detailed maps, GPS navigation, high-tech gear and mobile phones. Modern roads and transport mean we can reach almost any part of Scotland for a day's or weekend's hill going. We can further appreciate Heddle's achievements when we remember how different things were in his day. First, access. In his day, landowners and shooting tenants put large parts of Scotland off limits throughout the year, so access demanded negotiation or influence. Then maps. The remote areas of Scotland remained unmapped in any useful sense in the first few decades of his explorations. The Ordnance Survey started in the south only in the 1850s and progressed northwards, publishing maps on the 6-inch scale, followed a few years later by the rather more practical 1-inch scale, similar to today's Land Ranger series. The first record of Heddle using OS 1-inch maps in the field is in 1875, but the last 1-inch map covering a 3,000-foot mountain did not appear until 1890. What about transport? There were very few railways in the Highlands during Heddle's main exploration period, although they increased during his lifetime. Development happened piecemeal, organised by different local companies, and it wasn't until the start of the 20th century that everything joined up. The road network was limited and basic before the advent of the motor car and tarmac surfaces. Main roads were the 18th century military ones, supplemented by a further network of 920 miles of road built by the government between 1803 and 1820. The bulk of the country was much dependent on estate tracks and traditional drove routes. In Heddle's day, one travelled on foot, horseback, by private horse-drawn trap or public mail coach. When Munro first met Heddle in 1883, it was on a horse-drawn mail coach heading for Fort William, perhaps like the one in the picture. It was therefore the sea that was the most convenient means of reaching distant destinations. Heddle wrote, I quote, "It is not practicable to collect minerals in Shetland and the Western Isles with either success or comfort in any other way than by taking a yacht as a travelling habitation." Heddle's main companion between 1850 and the 1870s was Patrick Dudgeon, an able amateur mineralogist who had retired to Dumfries after making his fortune trading in the Far East. Dudgeon had the money to own the yacht they used for exploring the islands and mainland coastal regions, and Heddle too was adept at handling small boats, a skill that he'd learned in his Orkney childhood. It's not surprising that Heddle included navigational information when he published his geological map of Shetland in 1879. The other person with whom Heddle explored the Scottish islands and coastal mainland was John Harvey Brown, who Heddle met in 1879. He was a wealthy amateur natural historian who was working on a series of what are magnificent books about Scottish wildlife, for which Heddle wrote the geological chapters. Between 1881 and 1894, Heddle went on 7 summer voyages with Harvey Brown, each lasting up to 6 weeks. These cruises allowed Heddle to examine the geology and mineralogy of the islands more thoroughly than had been done before. Harvey Brown had the Chiontel built to his own design. She included storage space for natural history specimens, for example. Chiontel carried a crew of 4, including a steward. And Harvey Brown also took along a photographer, William Norrie, to take pictures for his books. This is part of an OS 1-inch map of the Sound of Harris, marked by Heddle to show the route of Harvey Brown's boat and his own extensive perambulations on land. Capaval, top left, Loch Langavat, centre right, and Ronaval, bottom right, are important mineral localities, all mentioned in the Mineralogy of Scotland. Now, in his journals, Harvey Brown recorded that during their cruises, Heddle also did a lot of hill walking for its own sake. For example, when they were on Jura in 1887, he climbed the Paps, and during the 1888 cruise, he was dropped at the foot of Hecla on South Uist and collected 13 miles further down the coast at Loch Aynot after he had traversed the Benvor range. On the right of this slide, we can see Norrie's photo of Heddle climbing Askeval on Rum in 1889. There's a little yellow asterisk under Heddle's body, if you can see that. Heddle regarded the Rum Mountains as more difficult and dangerous than those of the Coolins in Skye. Right, let's move on now from maps, transport, islands and the sea, and look at examples of Heddle's exploration of Scotland's mainland. University sessions finished in March, so he could spend most of the 6 summer months exploring Scotland in search of new mineral localities. Let me describe an expedition that took place in the spring of 1878 and lasted over a month. The first part of Heddle's journey started at Reconich and lasted 10 days. It began with an ascent of Foinavan and continued round the coast to Cape Wrath and Durness and back through Strathdonnard. I don't know if you can see, but I've numbered the sequence of his journey on the slide with the letter O representing his overnight stops. The inset shows part of this same route marked by Heddle himself on one of his own maps. At OS times 5, sort of bottom right-hand area, Heddle used Gob and Whisky Lodge as his base for Ben Hope, Ben He, and the group of hills around Mellia Corrivic Dougal, southeast of Arkle. When Heddle left the lodge, he used a carriage as far as Loch Moor and then walked over the hills to Cowskew. And the next slide shows where he went next. From Cowskew, he proceeded to Loch Inver, then followed the newly built road past Stack Polly to Ullapool. From there, he took a steamer to Stornoway and went over to the west coast of Lewis to explore round Loch Rogue. Next, he sailed to Portree on Skye, after which he spent 3 days at Staffin exploring the Quirang. From there, he went to Sligerhan on his way to the Coolins, of which more later, and Loch Corrusk. He ended the expedition with a week on Rum. Throughout the journey, Heddle noted his mineral finds and other geological observations. It appears that Heddle undertook several such lengthy excursions each summer season, so from this account one can readily envisage how, throughout his life, he methodically covered the whole country. Now, at this point, I must say something about Scottish geology in the 19th century and refer particularly to the major issue known as the Highlands Controversy. The Geological Survey started its work in Scotland only in the early 1850s using the new OS 6-inch maps. Previous geological maps were small-scale and very general. The latest of these was produced in 1861 by the Geological Survey's director, Sir Roderick Murchison, helped by Heddle's friend Archibald Geekie, who worked for the survey. Murchison based his map on the work of predecessors and on his own necessarily time-constrained observations of the terrain. Murchison's opinion was that Scotland's geology consisted of a stratigraphic sequence of successive layers of different types of rock. At this time, the geology of the Northwest Highlands was generally accepted as presenting the biggest problems of interpretation. Professor James Nicholl of Aberdeen, another friend of Heddle, fell out with Murchison in 1860 when he demonstrated evidence of faulting that was incompatible with Murchison's theory. In those days, matters were decided by patronage and debate in learned societies, so the powerful Murchison won the day, and Nicholl, albeit without conceding, withdrew from the fight. This left Murchison's opinion as the accepted interpretation, and when Murchison died in 1871, Geekie took over as director of the Geological Survey, and he maintained this position. Later, however, between 1881 and 83, independent geologists Charles Lapworth and Charles Calloway amongst others, explored the area and posed fundamental questions about the Murchison-Geekie opinion. Geekie was obliged to send his best geologists, Ben Peach and John Horne, to investigate. They told Geekie that the critics were right, and in 1884, Geekie conceded that there had been a massive overriding of younger rock by older rock in a line from tongue to sky, east to west. And this is what we know as the Moyne Thrust. Okay? Now, in the early 1880s, the debate on the Northwest Highlands was really hotting up, with Heddle deeply involved and knowing all the key players. His extensive exploration of Sutherland led to the publication of 6 long papers between 1881 and 84, totalling 320 pages, as well as his geological map of Sutherland in 1882. Heddle had studied all the old and current published material in preparation for making his own observations. To justify his opinions, he published a list of all the hills that he had climbed during his research, confident that despite omissions, no one else had been as thorough. His list has 80 high points. He includes places like Handa Island, as well as high peaks like Anchalach. This slide omits the 20 hills in his Torridon Dundonald Kinlochew list for reasons of space. We must remember that Heddle did much more than climb the peaks by a hill-walking route. Examining geological evidence involved extensive straight-line traverses across the landscape, no matter how rough and difficult the ground. Heddle said that for his map, he walked and drew 18 sections of the area between Kinlochew and Loch Glencool, a crowfly's distance of 50 miles. Now, this is part of a 1/4 inch to the mile map of Sutherland, on which Heddle drew his routes. One can see the red lines to the centre right, the great lengths to which he went as he tried to understand the complex geology around Elphin, Conneval, Benmore-Asint and Loch Glencool. Heddle wrestled with the problems of conflicting evidence, sometimes supporting one camp in the debate, sometimes the other. The problem was the size and roughness of the area, whose geology was much more complex than the participants realised. They often missed significant features, and because nobody had seen all the necessary evidence, they were often arguing at cross purposes. Now, this is a map of the Pentland Firth coast, marked by Heddle, copied onto a 1-inch OS map. It shows the routes of his coastal traverse starting at Whiten Head on Loch Eriboll and continuing eastwards to Strathy, Ray and Caithness. Note how he went all along the cliff tops to examine the rock exposures and then pursued the evidence inland. It's hard to estimate how far he walked on this particular expedition, but just the coastal walk from Whiten Head to Ray is around 65 or 70 miles long. I've also included on this slide part of Heddle's geological map from 1882, which, with his final Sutherland paper of 1888, was published before the outcome of the Highlands controversy was achieved. Let's move on from Heddle's work in the far north and look at other aspects of his methods. Fruitful sources of minerals were sea cliffs and rockfall debris. Heddle would study the geology from a boat, looking for likely mineral localities. If a target was inaccessible from the shore, he would land nearby, find a way up, and use ropes to descend the cliffs. The eminent Dr. Sir Hector Cameron, who was a student at St Andrews between 1858 and 1862, wrote that during his lectures, Heddle would relate, I quote, his miraculous escapes from death, which he more than once had when, suspended by ropes, he was collecting minerals from the face of some beetling precipice, beetling meaning overhanging. Because of its lack of rope protection, the most hazardous locality he described was that of the scarce mineral chlorophyte on the west coast of Rum. Inaccessible from the sea, it consisted of 800-foot cliffs with a 78-degree angle, where the mineral fell from weathered crags and could be found in debris trapped by grass cover. Heddle wrote, I quote, "Where grass-clad, the slope is, to well-tacked boots, nothing beyond an unusually tough hand and foot scramble." But he went on to say that things were treacherous due to, I quote, "the difficulties special to carrying heavy overbalancing hammers, breaking rocks where there is little foothold, and when that which is grasped is readily set upon the move." Heddle also spent time at quarries and underground in new railway tunnels and mines. Lead, copper and other ore mines were especially important to him because of the workings exposed a variety of minerals. Best known were the mines of Lead Hills, Wanlock Head and Strontian, but Heddle also visited other small mines. It took a lot of guts to explore such places in the conditions of the mid-19th century with no electric lighting or modern safety equipment. We now move on to look at Heddle's major contribution to the Royal Society of Edinburgh's Boulder Committee, which was active for 10 years between 1872 and 1882. Its purpose was to record the locations of erratic boulders in Scotland, determine their composition, where they'd come from, and how they got there. The committee got its base data from a survey of parish ministers and schoolmasters. Committee members then investigated the reports in the field. Their expertise was insufficient, however, so in 1879, Heddle was brought onto the committee. He was arguably the only person with enough practical knowledge of Scottish geology to do this task, and he was also blessed with a phenomenal memory. Accordingly, Heddle was given a demanding list of areas to explore, and for the 4 years 1879 to 82, he spent several months each summer on Boulder Committee work. Unlike other committee members, Heddle went high to the peaks and along the ridges. This was to better observe the terrain below, and because he knew that boulders found at altitude must be in their original position. Heddle inevitably found himself looking out for unreported erratics too. One example of Heddle's work is that he was able to state with certainty that erratics found around Loch Tulla near Bridge of Orkney and on Schiehallion had come from the mountains Stobcorrie and Albany in Glen Etive, 8 and 25 miles away respectively. The 6th to 9th annual reports contain either Heddle's own notes or an edited version of them. Uniquely, the 7th report describes in detail 10 consecutive days of the 1880 season that Heddle spent in the Crianlarich area. Day 1 saw him traverse Ben Lomond to Inversnaid. On day 2, he went over Ben Vorlich to Inveranen, and on day 3 over Ben Hur and Ancastile to Crianlarich. On day 4, he did a circuit taking in Ben Callum and Craigvor. On day 5, he repeated much of day 4 to re-examine the terrain and then returned to Crianlarich after covering 26 miles and 7,900 feet of ascent. And those are his measurements. On day 6, he traversed Ben Doran to reach Inveroran. Day 7 saw him returning via Crianlarich to Lewib Station to explore the slopes of Ben More and eastwards. On day 8, he traversed Ben More, Stobinian, Stobcorrie and Lochan and the Braes of Balquhidder to reach Lochan Head. On day 9, he crossed Ben Vorlich and Stucacroin to reach Callander, and finally on day 10, he went over Ben Ledi and Ben Vane, ending at Strathire. I calculate that over these 10 days, Heddle walked 128 miles and climbed 49,000 feet or 15,000 metres. I should add that after this, he continued his work, spending a fortnight exploring Ardgour and Morven. Perhaps the best testimony of Heddle's work for the Boulder Committee is the chairman's note in the report. I quote, "These extracts give no idea of the enormous amount of labour which the professor has undergone in his Boulder researches. During the summer and autumn of 1880, he must have walked several hundred miles over districts, many of which are not accessible to ordinary pedestrians. This is shown by the tracks of his surveys laid down by him on the ordnance maps and by the names given in his notes of the hills and valleys visited. The chairman's comment about Heddle's drive and energy is further borne out by this map that accompanies the committee's 8th report. It shows Heddle's Loch Arbor routes in 1881, centred on Ben Nevis. Heddle explored the mountains on both sides of Loch Linnhe, recrossing the loch several times and eventually identifying that boulders found on the western hills had come from the hills on the east side. He ascended the Ben twice, then the two Anachs and the entire Grey Corries range, as well as 5 of the Mamors. Impressive as these efforts are, they formed only part of his work that he did that year. I'm now going to change tack completely. We leave Heddle's hill-going associated with science and talk about Heddle as an aesthete and a sentient person who loved the hills for their own sake and for the physical and mental well-being they brought him. The first of his Sutherland papers of 1881 starts in a completely unexpected manner, saying of Sutherland, I quote, "If anyone could wander amidst the convoluted mazes of its hills without feeling his heart burning within him, it could only be from an utter want of sympathy with nature. The lungs play more freely, the stride gets longer, gravitation is an insignificant retardation, the big hammer's weight is scarce perceived. The whole man is improved in tone. Even in the midst of nature's warfare, one feels altogether benign." And the paper continues, much in the same vein. Okay. The Sutherland Mountains fired Heddle's imagination. He saw in them images of humans and animals with echoes of human experiences of life. He suggests that Cool Moor, top left, I quote, "quietly reposing upon her back, teaches Jura a lesson in depicting lines of female loveliness." He described Stack Polly, top right, as a porcupine in a state of extreme irascibility. Most know that Ben Loyal, bottom left, is called the Queen of the Scottish Peaks, but few know that the term was coined by Heddle. He wrote, I quote, "Thinking of Scotland's hills, we ever return to this as the queen of all. For gracefulness, chasteness, versatility, and nobility of form, it stands preeminent. As for the king, bottom right, it's more difficult to name the king, but we incline to a hill in Perthshire, when viewed from the shoulder of Ben Oss, a hill, strange enough, of the same name, Ben Louis." The bulk of Heddle's scientific writing on his mineral discoveries and analysis is just that, scientific. But such writing as appears in this first Sutherland paper reveals how the mountains inspired his artistic responses and his sense of spirituality. It also explains why, in October 1883, some members of the Mineralogical Society complained that Heddle's papers were, I quote, "not mineralogical, scarcely indeed scientific." The next of Heddle's big county papers was on Ross-shire, and it's regrettable that the Society decided not to publish it. And furthermore, the manuscript is lost. Okay. Let's now look at Heddle in Skye. The Store and Quiraing on the Trottenish Peninsula were major mineral localities that he first explored in 1855 and revisited many times. Skurnham Bog is 5 kilometres west of the Glen Brittle campsite. Its 200-metre cliffs and rocky boulder beach are one of the most famous of all Heddle localities and very hard of access. Heddle was active in the Coolins from the mid-1860s onwards, and particularly in the 1870s. He climbed at least 8 Coolin 3,000-foot peaks, including Sgurna Banadich, Bruchna-Frith, Amvastia and Sgurgerag. These had already been ascended by others, but many of the Coolin peaks were still unclimbed during these years. Heddle's is the first recorded ascent of Sgurr Hain, and in 1871 he climbed Sgurr Greta, marked with the yellow asterisk in the bottom left-hand picture, The 2011 SMC Coolin Guidebook credits Heddle with its first ascent, and a forthcoming SMC book on the history of climbing in the Coolins will confirm that Heddle's was the first recorded ascent of this major Coolin peak. Heddle had climbed Sgurn and Gillian twice before a third visit in 1880, when he was hurt as he led the descent from the summit. One of his legs was injured when a member of the party behind dislodged a boulder. In July 1888, Heddle and two companions climbed 2 peaks and a shoulder from a boat in Loch Brittle. He didn't name them, but it is likely that they went up the Great Stone Chute, traversed Sgurr Alastair and Sgurr Skemain, and then descended over Strawn na Quiche. Now to Ben Arn and the Cairngorms. 2 Heddle routes are shown here on a modern OS map, the detailed information coming from Heddle's 1893 Ben Arn article, the only one published in the SMC journal in his lifetime. It combines his thoughts about the 2 separate excursions, both starting and ending at the now ruined Loch Bilg Lodge in the east, made in 1877 and 1879. The article combines geological and hill walking information with humorous anecdotes. For example, when they encountered a keeper, I quote, "I immediately bethought me of the anti-friction flagon. Mountain dew is the proper lubricant of the hills. The keeper came with us. There might come to be hard work, and hard work calls for repeated lubrication." The OS had not fully surveyed Ben Arn when Munro drew up his tables, so he made use of the information and measurements in Heddle's paper when publishing corrections in 1893. Earlier, in his St Andrews talk in January 1875 about his Cairngorm expeditions the previous year, Heddle is recorded as saying, I quote, "To the maps of the trigonometrical survey, very high praise was accorded. The speaker stating that through careful study, especially of the shaded maps, he was able to extend his journeyings to a distance and with an ease which, without such aid, was not attainable." When he made these remarks, only 44 of the 131 sheets of the first edition of the OS 1-inch maps had been published. Okay. I must say something about Ben Nevis, which Heddle climbed several times using different routes. He had a reputation as a great storyteller. He also popularized his science in public lectures and meetings, always using striking images. In December 1881, he declared that Ben Nevis was being cut in 4. One can imagine the tut-tuts of disbelief, but Heddle was supported by Clement Wragg, the meteorologist whose daily ascents of the Ben from June to October that year contributed to the decision to build the Ben Nevis Observatory. Wragg verified that the cliffs of the northeast face were indeed being eroded, the evidence being the number of rocks that were blown by violent winds up onto the snowpack. When the observatory was opened in October 1883, Heddle was in the official party that climbed the Ben for the opening ceremony. He was also chosen to propose a toast at the celebratory dinner in Fort William that evening. Now, one of the pleasures for me of doing this talk in different places is that I can include material relevant to where I'm speaking. So this evening I can say more about Sutherland than just the Highlands controversy. Heddle's most frequent co-worker here was the Reverend James Maxwell Joss, the minister of Eddington. A true polymath, he conducted a huge correspondence with Reverend George Gordon of Burney, who founded the Elgin Museum in 1843 and who was consulted by Darwin and T.H. Huxley. Despite Joss's fame amongst cognoscenti, no photo of him is known, hence the image of his grave on the bottom right-hand side. Joss's many antiquarian and scientific interests brought him to the attention of the 3rd Duke of Sutherland, who in 1866 persuaded him to move to Golspie Parish, where his additional duties were to be the librarian at Dunrobin Castle and to establish a natural history museum, which is still there. The Duke's interests meant that he was very supportive of Heddle, who in his notes on his 1882 geological map of Sutherland said that his field work was possible only thanks to, I quote, the open-handed hospitality of a whole county at the behest of its noble proprietor. On another occasion, the Duke intervened on Heddle's behalf when he was seeking a scientific grant. Heddle gave the Duke some of the largest and finest mineral specimens found on his lands, and while one or two local minerals remain in the museum, the whereabouts of Heddle's great specimens are not now known. Okay. The Dukes of Sutherland are tarred with the brush of the clearances, but the third Duke, who lived from 1828 to 1892, did much to deserve a more favourable reputation. He played a major part in the extension of the railway and funded public works like drainage and roads that benefit not just the local population, but Heddle too. Joss went on a number of mineralogical expeditions with Heddle and Dudgeon. Being on the spot, he knew where the Duke's works were to be undertaken. He told Heddle, who was allowed to inspect the localities when the works were in train. Discovered in this way were important mineral localities near Tun and through land reclamation schemes at Shiness and Collarbole on Loch Shin. On other occasions, Joss did the necessary mineralogical work when Heddle was unavailable. Knowing Joss's interests, parishioners tipped him off about mineral and other interesting natural history and archaeological localities. It was thus that in 1875, Joss and Nicol discovered the 100-ton syenite boulder on Ben Vrec near Tun that has assumed almost mythical status. It originated on Ben Loyal, about 4 miles to the south, and was transported by glacial action. Heddle described it as, I quote, mineralogically the most wonderful and interesting stone in Scotland, a perfect mineral casket, containing in its small bulk as many minerals as do some counties. Heddle extracted no fewer than 17 minerals from the 2-foot-wide vein in this boulder, including a new mineral, and in 1877 reported his findings to the Royal Society of Edinburgh and in the journal Nature. Joss also visited Kildonan during the gold rush in 1868-9 and soon published his observations. Sometime later, he and Heddle inspected the area together. Heddle's findings, published in 1884, concluded that there was, quote, no widespread deposit, but several independent centres connected with the local rocks. On the map, you can see a Heddle route at Kildonan Burn, and he circled Susgill and its burn. The Duke stopped issuing prospecting licences in December 1869. But in 1880, always on the lookout for a profit, he sent Heddle samples of crushed quartz from a different locality for analysis and asked for his opinion. Heddle advised there was insufficient gold for exploitation. Heddle was involved briefly in gold mining in South Africa. In 1883, ahead of his formal retirement from St Andrews, he was employed by the Lisbon-Berlin Transvaal Goldfields Limited as its technical expert. Unbeknown to Heddle, its chairman, Baron Albert Grant, was a dodgy financier who, in large share issue advertisement, used Heddle's reputation and the promise of great rewards to attract investors. At this stage, Heddle had not seen the site, and when he got to South Africa, he found the company's claims to be much exaggerated. He told them so and returned home. The company then trashed Heddle's reputation in the press and sued him for breach of contract, but Heddle threatened a counterclaim that would have exposed the company's dire financial position. As a result, it withdrew, and Heddle kept all his earnings and, importantly, a valuable annuity which well exceeded his professorial pension. Heddle was right. A few months later, the company went bust. We've now reached the final section of my talk, in which I'll focus on Hugh Munro, Heddle and the Munros. In September 1891, Hugh Munro published his tables of the 3,000 feet mountains of Scotland. By then, Munro had climbed only 100 of these, but he was an exceptionally efficient information gatherer, recorder and analyst who produced his tables after less than a year's work. Munro got his information from OS and other maps, plus information provided by other SMC members about mountains not fully surveyed by the OS. Thus, he used Heddle measurements for some 5 peaks. Munro's tables recorded 538 summits over 3,000 feet, of which he regarded 283 as separate mountains and 255 as subsidiary tops. The first person credited with climbing all of Munro's separate mountains is the Reverend A.E. Robertson, who became the first Munroist in 1901. Now, these 2 manuscript extracts precede Munro's tables and reveal Heddle's opinion that there were 409 mountains in Scotland exceeding 3,000 feet in height. Heddle's list has not survived, and I've not been able to reconstruct it. His research was perhaps less thorough than Munro's, but he must also have discounted many of Munro's tops. But what about Heddle's ascents? He told the St Andrews Literary and Philosophical Society that he had climbed 350 of the 409. You can see from Heddle's letter to Geekie that he, on 350, was engaged in a friendly competition with SMC members Peyton on 270 and Colin Phillip on 260. You'll also note his intention to climb 5 more in Glen Lyon, which I've identified as the Carn Meg and Mail Garve group. This made his total 355. A later letter says he climbed 357, but I've been unable to identify those last 2. By combining information on Heddle's marked maps with written sources, I have been able to construct a close approximation to Heddle's list of ascents, although some known ascents, and perhaps there are others, are not shown on the maps. Until recently, I had assumed that Heddle had only a few of Munro's separate mountains left to climb, and I had expressed the view that if Munro had published the tables a couple of years earlier, Heddle could have been the first Munroist. Study of the recently discovered Heddle maps requires me to revise this opinion, however. Of Heddle's 357 ascents, I identified 346, of which 187 are separate mountains or Munros and 159 are tops. Even if the balance of 11 were all Munros, Heddle was still 85 short. In view of access problems and Heddle's increasing infirmity, I now wonder if he could have climbed all the remaining separate mountains over the 2 or 3 years preceding 1891. However, and a big however, the distinction between separate mountains and tops did not exist for Heddle. Also, his priorities over the years were determined by geological and mineralogical considerations and not by peak bagging. It is quite obvious from what we've seen tonight that if bagging all the 3,000ers had been his main aim, Heddle would easily have completed them some years before. To put things in perspective, the Reverend A.E. Robertson, the first Munroist, climbed his first Munro, Ben Cruachan, only in 1889, and by the time Heddle gave up in 1892 with 357 ascents, Robertson had climbed 10 or fewer. Even when the by now inactive Heddle died in 1897, Robertson had climbed barely 100. Let's end with the closing words of Hugh Munro's obituary of Heddle. I quote, "When in December 1896 I called to ask Professor Heddle to respond to the toast of the Highland Hills at the forthcoming dinner in Edinburgh, he told me that his climbing days were over, that he had no longer the physical strength or health requisite. His love of the mountains, however, was unabated. No one who was present at that dinner and who listened to what, though not the principal toast, was undoubtedly the speech of the evening, will ever forget the graceful eloquence of that soul-stirring address, breathing the very spirit of the mountains. It is indeed a privilege to have heard it and to have known Professor Heddle." I hope that this evening you too have enjoyed the company of Forster Heddle. I also hope that you will agree with me that when existing books on the story of Scottish mountaineering are revised, and when new ones are written, Forster Heddle, a true pioneer of the Scottish mountains, should find a much more prominent place in them than is the case at present. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, Hamish, for a very entertaining and informative talk. It was a really fitting way, I think, to end our seminar series. There is some time for questions. I think in deference to the fact that poor Jamie's out there in VC land on her own,
yes.
I won't defer to VC first, but if you have a question, just wave at us and we'll bring you in. But I'll throw questions out open to the floor now.
Do you know much about his home life? I mean, obviously he doesn't spend an awful lot of time home, from what you say.
Hang on, I'm going to stick my hearing aid in. No, I can hear myself well enough, but not other people. Oh, the battery's disappeared. Sorry, wait a minute. Ian, can you just repeat the question?
Yes, you were asked about his home life.
His home life, yes, indeed. Well, he as I said, he had, more than 10 children, because a number of them died. And he was away most of the time in the summer season for all those, 30, 40 years. And I keep reminding myself to do this, to look at the dates of birth of the children to see when they were conceived. It must have been in the winter. It must have been in the winter time, because then, of course, the university was in session from sort of October through to March. So, and it was during that time that Heddle did all his chemical analyses of the minerals, and also a lot of optical analyses. He was an early practitioner of thin sections and things like that. And that's when he did all that scientific work. And if you look at his book, The Mineralogy of Scotland, the last quarter of both two volumes, at least, consists of minutely accurate drawings of all the different crystals of all the different minerals. So he did all that work during the winter time. So presumably he and his wife communicated during that period. Time. During the summertime, there are references when he resents having to go back to St Andrews because it's keeping him away from his beloved mineralogy. But he had to do that, presumably for a variety of reasons. There would be certain personal admin things to have to deal with. There would be all the specimens that he'd collected that would have to be returned, sort of all the rest of it. A lot of the material was transported back by train, packaged up and back by train, and some, of course, got lost to his chagrin. But there's other than the existence of all the children, there are no personal letters. There is a letter from his wife, but not to Heddle. To one of his children, but he must have been a difficult man to live with. And described must have been extremely tolerant, like all wives.
Thank you.
Right. Sorry.
You mentioned
Elizabeth,
the Northwest Sutherland controversy.
Yeah.
What about Louis Agassiz ideas about glaciers? I can't remember his dates. Yeah. So was Heddle part of that? I mean, clearly some of the stuff you're saying about his work in the Boulder Committee is dealing with erratics carried by glaciers. What are Louis Agassiz's dates of his theory, and how did it engage with that?
Right. Well, this is the point at which I say that I'm not a geologist. But all I can say, I don't know. All I can say is that I never came across. Well, there must be references in some of the published papers, but I think the general glacial theory was sort of secondary, possibly, to his own interests. Although he certainly when doing the Boulder Committee work, did make observations about the directions of the different striations and things, and he would say, well, these, the northwest to southeast or whatever the direction was, but I don't recall him sort of coming up with a general theory of that, or so not very helpful answer, I'm afraid.
Do you recall your grandmother talking about her father when you were growing up?
Well, it was my great grandmother. He's my great great grandfather. So I knew my grandmother. Yeah. Who was born around about 1890 thereabouts. She was pretty young when he died at the age of when she was about 7. No, I don't. My own mother, Heddle lived for the last few decades of his life at St Leonard's House in St Andrews. My own mother used to stay there, but that was after Heddle's death. The earliest memory I have of him is there's a butterfly-shaped brooch. My mother used to wear that, and that Heddle had these brooches made for his daughters. And we know there was another descendant had an example, not as good as had a crack in it, So all the information is a bit second hand, and most of the family stories I know, post-date Heddle's life.
As you were growing up, were there stories told about Heddle to you? Probably the one there was his youngest son married. Was a different generation because of the length of time, and she died about 5-6 years ago. Ethel, probably, and she was born in America and then came across and spent a lot of time living with the aunts in St Leonard's House, and she probably had more to tell me, but again it was pretty vague. And for the research for the book, obviously I only used information that could be properly sourced, and so most of the stories I heard were not in there because they were about the aunts and things. But he certainly had a rough time at St Andrews. There's no doubt about that. And I was at that university myself, by the way, which was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. But he had that's a whole story. We had a really rough time there for various reasons, and the story of his parenthood is fascinating. West Africa, with in that period is it's all mixed up with the end of with the legislation for the ending of slave trading, and the wars with the French, and it's fascinating. There's another book in there, I think, somewhere.
Many years ago. I went to Zimbabwe and we were camping and cycling, and we stopped at a house that was had a campsite attached to it. It was called Malseta.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes,
we said where we were from.
Yeah.
They were asking us where we were from.
Yeah.
They said, "Oh, if you're from Scotland, you must meet the old lady."
Yes, right. I know. Yes, I can think. Yes, I mentioned how. Robert Heddle had come back with his money from West Africa, and bought Malseta from the trustees of the bankrupt Major Moody. Now Moody had a number of children, several sons, and I can't remember immediately the Christian names of them, but one of them in particular, supported by one or two others, decided to emigrate from Malseta to South Africa. He bought or hired or rented or commissioned 3 vessels. He advertised for people who might wish to go there. He was looking for people from all sorts of different trades and skills and whatnot. The 3 ships went out in sequence, I think. We're talking now about maybe 1816, something like that. Went out to probably somewhere around the Cape, and established a colony effectively there. But he was disappointed because he didn't really get the government support that he was looking for. Strategically, South Africa was at that point less interesting and less affordable for a broke government than other parts of the world geopolitically. So they had a bit of a rough time. Yes, there was then a great trek up to the north and east, and inevitably, yes, they used local names.
The old lady that we met, this was probably 25, 30 years ago, was in her 90s, and she had been brought as a baby on that trek in a covered wagon, and they made a circle at night.
Yeah, there's a book published in about 1950-ish. I've got a copy at home, called The Moody's of Melsetter, and that tells the whole story of the Moody's, who go back, yonks, and the decline of the family and its wealth, and for a variety of reasons, and then leading up to Major Moody's bankruptcy and this emigration. So I can't remember the name of the author, but if you're interested, through Ian, I can get you the details of the book.
Any other questions?
Well, I was wondering, did Forster Heddle, did he take any interest in the Strasse and what the countryside looked like? Because it wasn't that long after the clearances. It would be interesting to know just exactly the impression at that particular time.
Yes, no. He didn't. Well, I'd go back to a point I made earlier that what I've been able to say about him and write about him is based on what survives, and you could tell from some of the quotations I gave that he was a meticulous recorder of everything. And he was doing all this field work for any number of decades, and he must have had huge numbers of logbooks and notebooks and things, and nobody knows where they are. So, as I said, all I've been able to say is what things for which there's evidence. Who knows if his notebooks and things had survived, he might well have put in a variety of observations about social conditions and so on. The paper Southwest Ross that I referred to does show how on that trip, and presumably on others as well, they would, because he wasn't always on his own. Often he was, but sometimes he wasn't. On this occasion with Reverend Peyton. But the arrangements were that the rules of Highland hospitality, that if somebody turned up, you were taken in. So there's some quite interesting little descriptions in there of how they were staying with shepherds or estate workers or whatever. To the extent one, the lady of the house washed all their clothes and dried them in front of the fire overnight and got fresh clothes and so on. The other sort of thing that comes to mind, I mentioned access problems, and you probably couldn't read it in that letter, the second of the two quotations towards the end. He said he was going to do these 5 3,000ers in Glen Lyon. He also said in that others would get unget-atable on account of Winans. Now that was a chap Winans. He was an American industrialist who'd made a huge amount of money selling or creating railways for Russia. And he came back and he bought up the leases, the shooting rights and the leases of almost every estate from Bewley to Kintail. And he excluded anybody and everybody. He had a sort of small private army, effectively, to keep people out. And he became a really sort of notorious person who was famous for suing a crofter at Morvich in Kintail, who had allowed his wife's pet lamb to cross a road and eat grass on Winnings's thing, on Winnings's estate. And this chap was completely notorious. And if you can follow the story of all this in things like the British Newspaper Archive or Scotsman or something, and he was absolutely hammered by the newspapers. But he was one of these people with couldn't be bothered by anybody else, just did his own thing. They used to have they didn't go deer stalking, but they had like grouse. They used to drive the deer like grouse. And it was a case of trying to maximise the number you could shoot in one day, and he had a legal confrontation with his neighbour, who was what was his name? I can't remember the name, but Lord somebody who lived nearby. The chap who invented the Labrador, or the not the Labrador, but there's
Retriever.
The Retriever, yeah. From near Canning. Anyway, so anyway, those are a few sort of random thoughts there.
I mean, there's no doubt that he would have observed stuff, because if you take his friend Archibald Geeky. I mean, one of the most compelling accounts we have of a clearance is Geeky's account of the clearance at Sushanish on Skye. So they must have been aware of this. There's no doubt about that. They wouldn't have walked. They were intelligent people. They wouldn't have walked around with blinking eyes.
No, indeed. But as far as his writings are concerned, he was a single-minded man. Single-minded. Totally focused on
probably need
on
the
his
log
science.
Books for that.
Sorry?
You probably need the log books.
Yes, indeed. Well, I've still got a hope. I've got that when he died, his a chap called Alex Toms married his eldest daughter, Clem, and he was responsible for leading the committee that ensured that the Mineralogy of Scotland was published. And his family was from Dundee. And he himself had become a student of Heddle's and built up his own big collection and everything. He subsequently gave his own collections to University College Dundee, as it was in those days. And I'm convinced that if he was in charge of Heddle's stuff, that would have gone to Dundee as well. And it's not quite straightforward, because about 20 years ago, when there was a revision of what was to be taught where, geology and mineralogy was removed from Dundee and went to Glasgow. So everything and anything that was catalogued went off to Glasgow. But it's still possible that somewhere in Dundee there is uncatalogued material in boxes somewhere down below. And these maps that you've seen examples of this evening were unknown until about 5 or 6 months ago, when I was liaising with senior member of the Earth Sciences Department in the museum, and fortunately she was very enthusiastic about Heddle and everything, and somehow or another these maps were found in a filing cabinet somewhere, locked, never been opened for God knows how long, opened with a jemmy,
there they were. So I'm hopeful, that somewhere in Dundee there might be something. So I have plans to try and explore that possibility, but you need to kind of be on site rather to. You need to deal with these things face to face and find somebody who's interested. So I've got plans as to how to do that. And there will be retired members of staff from the geology department in Dundee. Must still be a few of them around, and that's kind of possibly a way forward. I don't know, but I'm hoping that how wonderful that would be.
Be another book, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, yes. Indeed, I have to. Yes, major rewrite.
Yes.
It'd probably be yes. Yeah.
Well, unless there's any more questions or observations or comments, I think it's time to thank Hamish and to thank Jamie for dropping in. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, and we'll do it in the time-honoured fashion. Thank you very much again.
If anybody wants to buy a copy of the book, all the proceeds go to the museum. They don't go into my pocket at all. So if anybody's interested, then my helpful wife will gladly sell you a copy. And obviously I'd be happy to sign anything anybody wants.
And just to say thank you very much to everybody for coming tonight. As I said already, this is our last seminar of 2018. We resume again, hopefully, when the weather improves slightly in February. But if you're on our mailing list, you'll get early warning of it. If you're not on our mailing list and you would like to be on our mailing list, please see me straight after tonight's event. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Jamie.
Bye-bye.
This call has been disconnected. Thank you for joining.